The sky over Earth didn't turn black because of a storm. It turned black because of metal. Thousands of massive, jagged warships belonging to the galactic empire of silos had just exited hyperspace. They didn't come to talk. They didn't come to trade. They came to collect. The Xylos were famous for one thing, the blood tax. They were a lazy, brutal empire that used other species to do their dirty work. Their rule was simple: pay or perish. If you wanted your planet to keep its atmosphere, you had to hand over 10% of your people. These people were sent to the Crystal Mines on a desert moon. Nobody ever came back. It was a slow, painful death sentence. Every screen on Earth, from the giant billboards in Times Square to the tiny smartphones in people's pockets, suddenly flickered. A terrifying image appeared. It was the High General of Xylos. He had 4 eyes, scales like a lizard, and a voice that sounded like grinding rocks. "Humans," the general growled, "your planet has been cataloged. You have 24 hours to deliver 1 billion healthy adults to our transport ships. If you resist, we will burn your forests, boil your oceans, and turn your cities into glass. The choice is yours." The world panicked. People ran to grocery stores. Families hugged each other, crying. Governments went into emergency meetings. Everyone expected the world's leaders to launch every nuclear missile they had. It seemed like the only way to go out fighting. But 23 hours later, something strange happened. Instead of a fleet of fighter jets, a single, tiny, white shuttle took off from a landing pad in New Jersey. It looked like a toy compared to the massive Xylos flagship. It flew slowly, almost peacefully, toward the center of the alien fleet. Inside the Imperial flagship, the general was confused. "Are they surrendering already?" he mocked. "Bring the survivor to the bridge. I want to see the face of the first human slave." The airlock opened with a hiss. Out stepped a man named Arthur. He wasn't a 6-foot-tall soldier with big muscles. He was a 52-year-old man with thinning hair, a slightly crooked tie, and a cheap gray suit he'd probably bought on sale. He wasn't carrying a laser rifle. He was holding a battered leather briefcase with a broken latch. The general and his elite guards erupted in laughter. The sound was deafening. "Is this your champion?" the general shouted, pointing a claw at Arthur. "Does Earth send a grandfather to fight an army of 1,000,000 warriors? Do you plan to poke me with that pen in your pocket?" Arthur didn't flinch. He didn't look scared. In fact, he looked bored. He looked like a man who had spent too much time waiting in line at the DMV. He slowly set his briefcase on a high-tech control console. Snap, snap. He opened the latches. He pulled out a stack of paper so thick it looked like it could stop a bullet. "My name is Arthur P. Higgins," he said, his voice flat and professional. "I am a senior partner at Higgins & Associates, a law firm based in New York. I'm not here to fight you, General. I'm here to serve you." The general squinted his 4 eyes. "Serve me? You brought the list of slaves." "No," Arthur said, handing the general the first page. "I'm serving you with a notice of legal obstruction. Before you take a single human off this planet, you are legally required to sign these 400 disclosure forms. If you don't, I will file an injunction with the Intergalactic Trade Council that will freeze every single one of your bank accounts from here to the Andromeda Galaxy." The laughter in the room died instantly. The general looked at the paper. It was covered in tiny, confusing words, stamps and signatures. "What is this nonsense?" the general roared. "I have cannons. I have fire." Arthur adjusted his glasses. "And I have a copy of the Imperial Charter, which your empire signed 2,000 years ago to stay in the civilized species bracket. Section 8 says you can't take blood taxes without a 50-year environmental impact study. You didn't do the study, General. That makes this collection illegal. And in my world, we don't handle bullies with bombs. We handle them with paperwork." The general stared at the small man in the gray suit. For the first time in 1,000 years, the empire felt a cold shiver of fear. They weren't facing a soldier. They were facing a human lawyer. And as the galaxy was about to find out, a lawyer is much, much harder to kill than a hero. The High General's face turned a strange shade of purple. He was a man who had conquered star systems with a single command. Yet here he was, staring at a middle-aged human who seemed more interested in font sizes than orbital lasers. Arthur stood there, calm and immovable, like a boulder in a stream. 1 billion signatures. The general roared, his voice shaking the light fixtures of the bridge. "In triplicate. That is 3 billion pieces of paper. We are a digital empire." "You primitive monkey. We don't even use paper." Arthur reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small, old-fashioned fountain pen. He clicked it once. The sound was tiny. But in the sudden silence of the bridge, it sounded like a gunshot. "Then I suggest you start calibrating your printers, General," Arthur said, "because according to the Universal Notary Standards of 3042, which your empire authored with the Andromeda merchants. A digital signature from a transition species like humans is legally considered unverifiable, unless witnessed by a physical stamp. No stamp, no slave. No slave, no mining. And if you take them anyway, well, that's not a tax. That's kidnapping. And kidnapping carries a mandatory fund on 1,000-year freeze on all imperial trade assets. The general looked at his advisors. They were frantically tapping on their holographic tablets. One of them, a skinny alien with large, watery eyes, leaned over and whispered, "He's right, sir. If we violate the notary standards, the Intergalactic Bank will pull our credit rating by morning. We won't be able to buy fuel for the fleet." The general slammed his fist onto the table. "Fine. We will get the signatures. We have droids. We have speed. We will finish this by tomorrow." Arthur's smile didn't reach his eyes. It was the smile of a predator that had just seen its prey walk into a very large, very complicated cage. "There's one more thing, General. A small detail, really, but important." "What now?" the general hissed. "Under the Earth Labor Protection Act of 2024, Arthur began, pacing back and forth on the bridge as if it were a courtroom. "Which, I must remind you, became part of the local governing law the moment you declared this illegal tax collection. Every person signing a contract must be provided with a full, translated explanation of their duties, in their native language." The general shrugged. "So, we have translation droids. They speak every language." Arthur stopped pacing and looked the general dead in the eyes. "Earth has 7,000 languages, General, and about 30,000 dialects. You must provide a certified translator for each one, from Mandarin to Swahili, from Icelandic to the specific village slang of the deep Amazon. If a single human says, 'I didn't understand what I was signing,' the entire 1 billion person contract is void. All of it. We would have to start over from scratch." The bridge went silent. The scale of the task began to sink in. This wasn't just a hurdle, it was a mountain. The general looked out the view screen at the blue planet below. It had seemed so helpless an hour ago. Now, it looked like a giant ball of red tape. "You are stalling," the general growled, his hand drifting toward his laser pistol. "You think you can bore us into leaving. Stalling." Arthur looked offended. "General, I am a professional. I am simply ensuring that this blood tax is handled with the dignity and legal precision it deserves. After all, if your emperor found out you botched a 1 billion soul acquisition because you didn't want to hire enough translators, I imagine his reaction would be unpleasant." The general winced. The emperor did not like mistakes, especially mistakes that cost money. "And," Arthur added, pulling a fresh folder from his briefcase, "we need to talk about the medical disclosure forms. You see, humans are very fragile. We have allergies. Peanuts, gluten, dust, certain types of alien radiation. If you put a human with a shellfish allergy in a mine filled with iodine crystals, they die in 5 minutes. If they die due to managerial negligence, the Empire owes the family a death benefit of 5 million credits per person." Arthur did some quick math on a notepad. "That's 5 quadrillion credits in potential liability. Does the Imperial Treasury have that kind of liquidity? Or should I call the Galactic Insurance Bureau and tell them you're operating without a license?" The High General sank into his throne. He felt a headache coming on, a human headache. He looked at Arthur, the man in the cheap suit with the broken briefcase. "How long?" the general asked, his voice defeated. "How long will it take to do the signatures, the translations, and the medical forms?" Arthur looked at his watch. "With your current staff?" "Oh, about 26 years. Give or take a decade for the appeals process." The general's jaw dropped. 26 years! We are here to take the tax now. Justice, Arthur said, clicking his pen closed. Takes time. Now shall we start with the A's? I have the first 10,000 forms for people named Aaron right here. I'll need a desk. And some coffee. Human coffee, it's on the Empire's tab, of course. The trap was set. The Empire had the guns, but the humans had the rules. And as the general looked at the massive stack of paper, he realized for the first time that his warships might not be enough to win this war. 3 weeks had passed since the Xylos Empire arrived to conquer Earth. Usually, by this time, a planet was already hollowed out, its people shackled, and its resources stripped. But as the sun rose over the Imperial flagship for the 21st day, the scene inside was not one of conquest. It was a scene of pure, unadulterated misery. The massive warships, designed for cosmic destruction, had been turned into the galaxy's largest accounting offices. Thousands of elite Imperial stormtroopers, warriors who had been trained from birth to fire plasma rifles and pilot starfighters, were now hunched over holographic desks. Their eyes were bloodshot, and their clawed hands were cramped from holding digital pens. They weren't checking targets, they were checking birth certificates. The blood tax. was no longer a terrifying decree. It was a logistical black hole. Every time the general thought he was making progress, Arthur would appear on the bridge. He was always wearing that same gray suit, always carrying that same briefcase, and always holding a fresh cup of earth coffee that smelled like victory. "General, a moment of your time?" Arthur asked, stepping over a pile of rejected filing forms. The general looked up from a mountain of paperwork. His scales looked dull, and one of his 4 eyes was twitching uncontrollably. "What is it now, human?" "We have already processed the signatures for the first 10 million errands. We have translated the safety manuals into 300 types of Spanish. What could possibly be left?" Arthur pulled out a single, brightly colored sheet of paper. "I'm afraid we have a major issue regarding the pre-existing medical conditions clause under the Universal Labor Protection Act." The general growled, a low sound that vibrated the floor. "We are taking them to mines, Arthur. Not a spa. They don't need to be healthy." "Actually," Arthur said, clicking his pen with a satisfying thwack, "they do. According to the treaty your empire signed with the Galactic Bank, any forced labor must be physically capable of sustainable output. My team has been reviewing the medical records of the first batch of recruits. It turns out that 40% of them have things like back pain, nut allergies, or high blood pressure." Arthur leaned in, his voice dropping to a serious whisper. "If even one of these people dies in your mines because you didn't provide a gluten-free ration pack or an ergonomic shovel, the empire is legally liable for their life insurance. That is roughly 400 trillion imperial credits in payouts." The general's jaw literally dropped. "We don't pay life insurance. We are the Xylos. We take what we want." "You do if you want to keep your civilized status at the interstellar exchange," Arthur countered smoothly. "If you refuse to back these workers with insurance, the Galactic Bank will flag your empire as a high-risk debtor. Your currency will be devalued to 0 by noon tomorrow. Your soldiers won't be able to buy a sandwich, let alone a gallon of Starship fuel." The general looked at his financial advisor, who was nodding frantically with a look of pure terror. The empire was powerful, but it was built on a foundation of galactic trade. If the money stopped moving, the empire stopped breathing. "Fine," the general screamed, throwing a stapler across the room. "We will only take the perfectly healthy ones. Filter the list, now." Arthur didn't move. "That leads us to the next problem, the union of toddlers and seniors." The general froze. "The what?" "You're trying to take 10% of our population," Arthur explained, looking at his clipboard. "That includes our children and our elderly. However, under the Galactic Juvenile Protection Code, children cannot be moved more than 10 light years from their primary school without a parental consent waiver, signed by both parents and a court-appointed guardian. And as for the seniors, well, they are all currently protected by the Retirement Heritage Act. You can't take them because they are considered living historical artifacts." The general put his head in his hands. "So we can't take the sick, we can't take the kids, and we can't take the old people. Who is left?" "About 15% of your original target," Arthur said cheerfully. "But because the pool of available people has shrunk, we now have to renegotiate the labor density ratios. This requires a new series of public hearings in every major city on Earth. We've scheduled the first one in London for next Tuesday. You'll need to send a representative to discuss the Empire's policy on casual Fridays in the crystal mines." The High General let out a long, pathetic whine. He looked at his warriors. One of them was crying quietly over a stack of dental records. Another was trying to fix a jammed printer with a combat knife. "This is not a war," the general whispered to himself. "This is hell." "No, General," Arthur corrected him, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "This is a civil audit, and we've only just finished the first chapter." The general looked out at the fleet. The ships were burning through millions of credits worth of energy just sitting there, waiting for papers to be signed. The blood tax was supposed to make the empire rich. Instead, it was bankrupting them one form at a time. Arthur turned to leave, but then stopped. "Oh, I almost forgot. We're going to need to see the blueprints for your transport ships. We've had some complaints about the legroom. The Imperial flagship, once a symbol of absolute terror, now smelled like stale coffee and desperation. The hallways weren't filled with the sound of marching boots, but with the rhythmic clack of keyboards and the frantic rustle of paper. The cost of maintaining a fleet of 10,000 ships in Earth's orbit was astronomical. Every hour they sat there, they burned enough fuel to power a small sun. The Imperial Treasury back home was sending angry, red font messages every 10 minutes. The soldiers were at their breaking point. One commander had been found hiding in a supply closet, sobbing because he couldn't find a Form 12B in a pile of a million Form 12s. The High General stood in the center of the bridge, his cape tattered and his 4 eyes bloodshot. He looked at the mountain of folders, digital tablets, and physical scrolls surrounding his throne. He couldn't take it anymore. "Enoch," the general screamed, his voice cracking. He drew his plasma sword and sliced a stack of papers in half. "No more forms, no more translations, no more medical history. We are taking the healthy ones, only the strongest. We are leaving with our cargo in 1 hour, or I start dropping bombs. I don't care about the laws anymore." Arthur, who had been sitting in a folding chair in the corner of the bridge, slowly looked up from his crossword puzzle. He didn't look scared. He actually looked a bit sad, like a teacher watching a student fail an easy test. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, General," Arthur said, standing up and brushing some dust off his gray suit. "In fact, if you move those ships an inch toward the surface, you'll be committing what we call aggravated contempt of court."
"I am talk to you,"
the general roared. "Actually," Arthur said, pulling a very long, very official-looking scroll from his briefcase, "you're the defendant. While your soldiers were busy filing paperwork for the last 3 weeks, my team back on Earth wasn't just sitting around. We've been busy. We reached out to the ambassadors of the Gryphon sector, the Thalaxian hive, and the moons of Jupus." The general froze. "Why?" "Because," Arthur said, his voice becoming sharp and cold, "it turns out the Xylos Empire has been very naughty. We found evidence that your blood tax has been illegally collected from 12 other species over the last century. You ignored their local laws, skipped the environmental studies, and, worst of all, you never paid their retirement benefits." Arthur tossed the scroll onto the general's lap. "We just filed a universal class action lawsuit on behalf of the entire Milky Way galaxy. Since Earth is the only planet with a functioning law school that understands the Imperial Charter, we have been appointed as the legal representatives for every species you've ever bullied." The general's hands shook as he looked at the scroll. It wasn't just a list of names. It was a bill. "Damages," the general whispered, his voice trembling. "What is this number? There aren't even enough zeros in our language for this number." "Yes, damages," Arthur said. "We are seeking the immediate return of all stolen populations, plus 100 years of back pay at the Earth's minimum wage adjusted for galactic inflation. Oh, and interest. We really like interest." The general slumped back into his throne. "We can't pay this. Even if we sold every planet in our empire, we couldn't pay this." "I know," Arthur said with a small, dangerous smile. "Which is why the Intergalactic Court has already granted us a preliminary lion. As of 10 minutes ago, this flagship, your cruisers, and even that fancy plasma sword in your hand are legally the property of the City of London and the State of New York." A red light began flashing on the general's console. An automated voice spoke. "Asset seized. Internal power locked. Please vacate the premises for the new owners." You stole my fleet." The general gasped. "No," Arthur corrected him, snapping his briefcase shut. "I won it in a legal dispute. Now, according to the eviction notice I just served your computer system, you and your men have 20 minutes to get into your escape pods and leave. If you stay, you are trespassing on private Earth property. And trust me, General, you don't want to see what our property lawyers do to trespassers." The High General looked at his soldiers. They weren't even looking for their guns. They were already packing their bags, happy to finally be away from the paperwork. The Empire hadn't fallen to a rebellion. It had been repossessed. Arthur checked his watch. 19 minutes left, General. I'd hurry. The cleaning crew is coming in at noon, and they're very strict about their schedule. The great exodus of the Xylos Empire didn't look like a retreat. It looked like a desperate escape from a burning building. There were no epic explosions or heroic speeches. Instead, there was just the hum of thousands of escape pods launching and the frantic roar of engines as the massive warships, now technically owned by the City of London, were abandoned by their crews. The High General was the last to leave. As he stepped into his personal shuttle, he looked back at Arthur, who was busy putting little post-it notes on the bridge's main monitors. "You are monsters," the general whispered, his 4 eyes wide with a new kind of trauma. "We have fought warriors who could rip stars apart, but we have never faced anything as cold and heartless as a human with a briefcase." Arthur didn't even look up. "It's not heartless, General. It's just standard operating procedure. Oh, and don't forget to leave your keys on the counter. The new landlords are very particular about that." With a final, terrified hiss, the general closed his hatch and blasted away. Within minutes, the sky over Earth cleared. The metal clouds of war vanished as the Xylos fleet jumped into hyperspace, moving faster than they ever had in their history. They weren't just leaving Earth. They were fleeing a legal nightmare that would haunt their empire for the next 1,000 years. Down on the surface, the world was silent for a moment. Then, the cheering started. It began in New York, spread through London, and echoed across every continent. The people who had expected to be slaves in a crystal mine were now watching the greatest military force in the galaxy run away from a man in a gray suit. Arthur's shuttle landed back in a quiet field in New Jersey. He walked out, his suit a little wrinkled and his hair a bit messier than before. A crowd of reporters and world leaders rushed toward him, cameras flashing and microphones shoved into his face. "Arthur, did you use a secret weapon?" One reporter yelled. "Is the Empire destroyed?" Another asked. Arthur stopped and adjusted his glasses. "The Empire isn't destroyed," he said simply. "They've just been served. There's a big difference. One leaves a mess, the other leaves a bill. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have 6,000 unread emails and a very long nap to attend to." He walked past the shouting crowds, got into a regular yellow taxi, and headed back to his office in Manhattan. When he arrived at Higgins & Associates, the lobby was filled with flowers and champagne. His assistant, a young woman named Sarah, was staring at a computer screen with her mouth open. "Sir," she gasped as Arthur walked in. "You're back. The whole world is calling. The President, the Queen, even the guys from NASA. They want to know if we're finally safe." Arthur walked to his desk, sat down in his squeaky leather chair, and placed his battered briefcase on the table. He opened it, took out his fountain pen, and placed it neatly beside his notepad. "SAF?" Arthur asked, looking at a new notification blinking on his screen. It was an urgent transmission from the Alpha Centauri star cluster. They had seen what happened to the silos and were now desperately trying to send a peace and trade treaty. Before Arthur decided to look at their books too. "In this galaxy, Sarah, safe is just a word we use between lawsuits," Arthur said, clicking his pen. He looked at the message from the Alpha Centauri diplomats. They were offering Earth 50% of their spice trade just to stay on his good side. Arthur checked his watch. "Tell the Alpha Centauri representatives they have exactly 5 minutes to read our standard terms and conditions. If they want to negotiate the fine print, tell them my hourly rate just tripled. And Sarah." "Yes, sir?" "Tell them if they don't agree to the Human Rights and Fair Trade clause by page 10, I'll start looking into their ancestors' property taxes." Sarah laughed, but then she saw the look in Arthur's eyes. He wasn't joking. The galaxy had learned a terrifying lesson that day. Humans weren't the strongest species. They weren't the fastest. They didn't have the biggest ships or the hottest fires. But they had something much more dangerous. They had a system. They had rules. And they had the spiteful patience to use those rules to dismantle an empire without firing a single shot. As the sun set over the New York skyline, Arthur P. Higgins started typing his next opening statement. The era of the warrior was over. The era of the human lawyer had begun. And the stars would never be the same again.